Thank you all for coming. This is our third hard hat tour of the Aspen Community Church Restoration Project in Aspen, Colorado. And this church was constructed in 1889 and finished in 1890. And here we have Steve DeClute, who is our project manager for this construction project. And he is really going to be leading the tour and telling you about some of the remarkable aspects of the construction in 1890 and what has had to be done to match that historic nature and preservation of this building in doing the reconstruction. It's really a pretty amazing feat of how they put this building together in 1890 and the differences in how construction is done today versus then. So we're going to start our tour. Thank you all so much again for coming, and we hope you enjoy this.
I'm Steve DeClute. I work with Baker Construction and have been working on and off on the building for almost 4 years now. I'd like to give a bit of a presentation in a construction context, that being the challenges relating to the original construction and what we found along the way, as well as what we're doing to restore the building. So the building was designed by Frederick Hale in late 1880s, and the construction occurred in 89 and 90. It was finished in 1890. The material. So let me go into some of the challenges of its original construction. All the material, all of the masonry was pulled out of the frying pan up someplace around Rudeye. It's all called peach blow. And in the 1880s, there was a railroad spur that went up the frying pan. So all the material was quarried. It was rough in shape. All the material was hand stacked into horse-drawn wagons, and the wagons were pulled to the railway spur and loaded by hand onto cars. And then they were pulled down the frying pan and pulled up the Roaring Fork. And I think it was on Dean Street that the railway would stop. They would then hand load the material back onto a horse-drawn cart and pull it over to the church. All of the material was shaped by hand here. We know this because all of the pointing material, the pattern being called a grapevine, was tinted with all of the powdered material used that was generated from shaping all of the stone. So we calculated the weight of the building. We assumed, and I verified, that the foundation goes down about 6 feet, and we know the wall thickness, and so we did some calculations, some of the masons and I, and we figured that the building weighs 1,500 to 1,800 tons. So that's the quantity of material that was moved out of the frying pan. And so I asked myself, how much do these horse-drawn carriages, can you put 2,000 pounds on them? So there's 500 or 800 loads of horse-drawn wagons from the quarry to the railway and then unloading them. And all that material was hand stacked and delivered and organized here and then constructed. So the concept being to quarry the material and complete the whole building in the 13-month construction time is fascinating. It's unbelievable that they were able to accomplish all of this. And then we'll go around and I want to share with you some of the challenges involved in terms of hoisting stones to the top and erecting scaffolding in the interior of the sanctuary to plaster and so on. And to do all this in 14 months is quite remarkable. So you'll see the greatest care was given to the south face and to the west face of the building. So the masons, when they started constructing this, they would gather stones that were misshapen and create all these flat edges. So all these stones were irregular, and you'll see that they all have this rectilinear shape. So all of that was created here. The wall is 20 inches, 18, 20 inches thick in general terms. It consists of this very attractive outside facade. It consists of an interior that in general their goal was to make it flat. Flat so they could plaster the interior. The section between, the 6 or 7 inches between, so if I could describe an 18-inch wall, it would be a 6-inch exterior that's very attractive and you know, appears as if what we see here. And then a rectilinear flat face on the inside, and all the rubble and trash went into the middle. That's how the building was generally constructed. Tremendous care in terms of carving and detail work was offered on the south side and the west side. And I'll take you around here shortly and we'll look at the other sides. Not nearly as much care was given. They had the A-teams on these two sides and they really came out nice, and it's a little bit looser on the other sides. The tooling that we see is called grapevine. I have the lead foreman from Gallegos, Steve Lavin, who was responsible for all of this. Steve and I did the Christ Episcopal Church 4 or 5 years ago together. And so all the work that I'm involved with, he's involved with in general terms. Steve found original parts of the original pointing. We found sheltered pieces that were in good shape. Steve had tools made that were the same shape as the original pointing. We were able to find the interior, which is called the lens, the interior of the material. It was purplish and brown on the outside, all the pointing before we redid it. It had been exposed for 120 years to the elements and so on, and it was really unattractive. But if you snapped it, you could see the original color where it hadn't been exposed to the elements. And that was this salmony color. And so Steve explained to me when we first started this project that all the material was shaped here in general. They salvaged all the powder, and when it came time to do the pointing, they mixed that and did all of this. So Steve had created tools that were the original profile and shape of the original tooling, and then we took the color and had it sampled in a lab, and we had it reproduced in this historical context, meaning that the strength of it would work well with this sandstone. If you use new materials between these stones, there's no give, and the mortar is stronger than the stone, and the stone could be subject to breaking. So the mix, everything is quite specific. We found around the building numerous places where there had been settling and so on, and Steve and his crews installed stainless steel rods to help displace and disperse the weight. We're hoping that'll hold it all together. The building has never had gutters in general terms. So for 120 something years, the water has just poured off of the building. I mean, all of you probably have seen the building in November, January, February, and you can almost ice climb on the east side. The icicles get so substantial. All of this water that's been pouring down the building, it has infiltrated the masonry walls. And when water hits the original bedding material, it takes all the strength, takes all of the lime out of it, and leaves sand. So there was places when we first started on the east side in particular, where you could take a 10-inch screwdriver or some kind of other tool and you could stick the whole thing into the wall. There was no resistance, there was nothing in there. So part of what we've done, what Steve and his crew have done, is remove all of the bedding material that was loose, compromised from all the years of water infiltration. We would get back several inches and it would be like brand new. So all of that was pulled out. New bedding material was pushed in between the rocks, and the last 1.5 inches or so was reserved for this tinted pointing material. So it's really quite remarkable what was accomplished in 13 months to get this building built. To dig it, quarry all the material, and put a roof on it in 13 months is amazing. So, yeah.
Do you have any idea Many people were working on the building?
No, I know that it's got to be 100, 200, some number in there. I mean, it would take a tremendous team at the quarry, on site, just material handling. It would be significant. The building was built for $20,000, which isn't too much for, we spend that every couple of days around here. So what else can I share with you about
How do they cut the stone?
it's really soft.
Do they
Steve.
have chisels or they have bandsaws?
This is Steve Lavin from Gallegos.
Chiseling, you can really, it's soft enough to where you can chisel it and it holds together real good. It's not brittle, it doesn't fracture. And even before I even was on this project, I was always impressed with the peach blow material. You don't see much of it, and every time you did a little remodel job with it, it's really fun to work with because it's some of the easiest stone to work with and get the desired product.
How long would it take to shape one of these stones?
Oh, not knowing what kind of tools they had, knowing the kind of tools that we have now, it would probably cut that time to about 20% of the original time. But these pieces where they had the corners, where they had like 1.5 inches on both sides, where it was flattened, and then the pillow was left on the rest of the stone, the part that sticks way out. To get that, I would suspect it's probably a couple hours for an experienced mason to get to that point. Once the stone was in the general size,
To shape it?
Yeah.
The original bedding material.
Original bedding material is the historic nature of it is very lime orientated. Nowadays we have a lot of cement, Portland cement involved in our cement. Back then it was more lime than cement and a lot of sand. And with this kind of a structure, they were a lot smarter than we give them credit for, because the building would flex with that kind of material, and it would move with the different temperatures throughout the year, especially up here in Aspen with the extreme cold and the extreme heat with the sun that we get. And so the building did not crack like nowadays. If we were to put a brittle material in those joints with the soft sandstone in the bedding mortar, we would have a problem. The two would be fighting against each other.
And it would fracture the stone. We have benefited from this building never having been really remodeled. It's received an addition, it's received some upgrades in terms of utilities. But in general terms, the exterior, the structure itself, much of the interior, it's just as it was when it was completed. I mean, the things that we're working on in the attic are the things just the way that they were left in 1890. To express its value is that this is unchanged from 1890. And it's not common that that's the case anywhere. This building was one of the first buildings in Aspen to have electricity. And when we open up the walls and open up ceilings, you'll find knob and tube and open uninsulated wires that snake around. It's a little scary, but the original light fixture that's in the sanctuary, I think that it's original and that it was one of the first light fixtures in Aspen. There was a hydroelectric plant up the pass, I believe. So you'll see, let's walk down and let's look at this face. I'd like to point out a few details, and then we'll go ahead and I'd like to walk the whole building. If anyone has a question, please speak up.
Oh, we're going a different direction.
Of the front door, you'll see all of that stone is hand carved. It's a hand carved inlay, of which we're going to restore before all of this is done.
What kind of hoisting system did they use to build the walls up?
I suspect the exterior and the interior were completely scaffolded using lumber. I think that mining influence in terms of the labor force. So they likely scaffold like we have this using wood planks and a wood structure. And then they also use large poles where they would cantilever a large pole and have a pulley on the end of it. Some of the stones, and I'll take you inside of our little construction area here, but there's coping stones up on the gables. There's 3 gables And some of the coping stones are 400, 500 pounds. And so the thought of, we're going to use a crane. In fact, next week we're going to set all the coping stones. And we have the luxury of calling a crane and having it set all the stones for Steve. But the original masons, they had to figure out how to get it all up there. I'm sure they used things like pipes and pulleys, and were able to move the stones that way.
The church actually has a pretty interesting history in that you think back to what was going on in Aspen in the 1890s, and that was the silver boom. That's what was going on here. And so there were a lot of actual silver miners or guys who were working in the silver mines helping on this building, as well as some ranching families. Ranching was also big back then. And then you had Italian stonemasons who had come here to work in the mines or what have you. And the Aspen Community Church, in part, was built to be a central place where people could meet and have community, because during the silver boom, there were more brothels and bars than you can believe, because that was kind of the culture that was going on here. So this building was built in part to be a place where people could have some good, clean fun, so to speak. And also interesting, some famous folks have visited the church over the years. And Albert Schweitzer came here during the Goethe bicentennial, and it's rumored that he played the organ here because the Pepkes lived right around the corner, and he loved to play the organ. Reinhold Niebuhr, who is the author of the famous Serenity Prayer, also came here, and I believe that was in the early 70s, and did a sermon, which is great. And then also John Denver recorded one of his first Christmas albums with the Dickens Carolers, and that was in the early 80s. And so there's been some really interesting characters that have graced the church building to do community programs and or religious ones. So it's housed a lot of great characters over the 124 years of its standing.
I'd like to point out these 3 lower windows. To the left of the furthest left window, you'll find a little gray bit of pointing. So there's a few places around the building that we were able to maintain and leave the original pointing. So all of you will remember a church where all of the pointing was a gray or even a purplish, brownish color of pointing. And there's a fair amount on the west side of the bell tower as well. So as I mentioned, significant care and attention was given to the south side and to the east side. Let us go ahead and walk around the building and let me point out some of the details and some of the differences. Specifically, they only had limited resources, time and material, and they made some sacrifices along the way. It's kind of interesting to see where they chose to push. A grayish charcoal up on the bell tower, and we also found this color green as an original paint color, or sometime along the way it was painted that color. The roof, the vestry, the council is electing to stain the shingles this black color. So we're actually going to do it using some old methodology because it will best serve, it will last the longest. It's not really staining, but rather we're going to use equal parts boiled linseed oil and a turpentine paint thinner material, and powdered black graphite. And so the graphite, the turpentine will open up the cedar, the boiled linseed oil will carry the graphite into the pores of the wood, and essentially it becomes black, not by staining, but by an actual solid into the wood. So we're gonna dip all the shingles for the whole roof black first and then install them on the building. The gutter is lead-coated copper, and it's a historically correct material. When we tore the roof off, all of the valleys and a lot of the flashing was this same material, and so we have the luxury of reusing it. And in terms, it's a little expensive. It's expensive, but
Let's be honest.
It's expensive material, but it'll last 75, 80 years, much like the original flashing did. So moving around, there were numerous cracks that radiated out of some of these windows in the turret, and those have been, we hope that they have been corrected and stabilized. Quick.
Yeah, because
We call this battered, where the bottom of the building flares out. So the whole building is battered. So up over my head, the building is vertical and it comes down and it has this 8 or 10 inches of flare. So it's very attractive. It also helps the structure increase its footprint and have additional push, or this buttress that we'll see, the buttresses that we'll see on both the east and west sides. However, the building has never had any gutters or any kind of eaves, so all the water would fall off the roof and it would come down, it would fall vertical, and then it lands at this flare where it's battered. And there's times after a rain where you can just see where all the building gets wet, and those are also the same places where the building's in the worst shape. So part of the scope of work for this project, we will have gutters and downspouts on the whole building, and this will go as far as anything to mitigate any future damage from water infiltration.
So you're heating the gutters and downspouts.
We will. All of the corners have, Steve, what's the proper term for this? A point stock. So all of the corners, it's really attractive. They all have this detailing, and you'll see it on in general every corner.
Steve,
So,
was that done with a chisel or something like that?
An adze axe. What about the texturing on all the sills? Same?
That's where they use point stock.
You'll notice the format of all of the stone on this whole back alley side is significantly smaller than on the front side. They selected all of the nicest material for the south and for the west faces, and all the remaining material went to the exterior, went to these two sides, and the even less attractive material went to the interior, and then all the junk went on the inside. So let's move around. I'd like to show you guys some coping stones that we pulled off the building. That came off of the that came off of the gables. We've removed them. Steve and his crew broke them free, though they were already loose. And we picked them up with a crane, and we brought some of them down here. Some of these are 400 or 500 pound stones. When we started, in general, all the stones were loose. The stones had been sitting up on these gables at a steep angle, and they were loose, and they were completely exposed to the elements. And so all the rain and snow sat on them and infiltrated in between and would freeze and thaw and so on. And they slid down the hill, okay? They slid down the roof. The only reason they never fell off were the masons built little keystones and integrated these little scroll pieces. Unfortunately, we can't see it, but I wanted to show it to you here on the plans. And so there's this little decorative scroll piece, which was super ingenious because not only it integrates and ties back into the wall. So you can imagine that all of these were loose. And when we found it, there were gaps of 2 and 3 inches at this very top. And 0, 0, 0, these were all tight. And the only reason that they didn't slide off the roof was this scroll keeper piece was weighted by the masonry of the gable and wasn't allowed to move and was locked into the corner. And so these are some of the elements, or some of the construction techniques that I find so fascinating, that in 1890 they were tuned into little details like that. On Wednesday we'll start picking these up. So to prevent what happened, we have lead coated through flashing. We also have a stainless steel strap with pins above and below. So, and I can show it to you with those who get up on the scaffolding with me. But Steve has embedded these steel straps that I had built, and they are let in and secured to the stone below, and they have stainless steel pins that turn up, and we have drilled, and you'll see the drill holes in these pieces of coping, and so the pins will be received by those holes, and we'll have lead coated caps above, and this will prevent gravity from sliding the stones down in the future. Yeah. So if we can take a look around over here, you'll see, much like the alley side, additionally, there are plates, steel plates, washers, star plates, that and rods that tie through this, and the balconies are almost supported in this post-tension kind of thing, in this methodology where they are pulled back. And when we go into the sanctuary here shortly, you'll see that all of the the balcony itself is all cantilevered out, and so it's tied into these buttresses, which is part of the original architecture, the Romanesque architecture that the building was designed with. We started all of our sampling for the pointing, and again, we found some of the original material, we broke it open, we found the salmon color. We sent it off to a lab, we got a couple different variations, we started applying the variations. We put it on the first time and it was almost as red as the scaffolding, and we all panicked. And over 4 weeks, the original samples mellowed out so much that we could finally make a presentation and share them with the rest of the team, specifically the owner's rep and members of the congregation. And if I could, I'd like to show all of you this, but you'll see that a lot of the pointing isn't even matured enough, and we have a few areas over here that have reached the final color. See, and so in time, the whole building all the pointing will match this. We like this so much because it kind of blends in with the stone, and if you notice it lets the stone be stone, and the pointing kind of goes away because it's the same color. So you'll see various different generations of pointing that we did along the way, trying to establish this. So we had some confidence that the whole building would turn that direction, turn that color. Does anyone have any questions?
I do. The foundation. What kind of shape is the foundation in?
The foundation is essentially this same type of wall, larger format material, 5-6 feet down. There's a fair amount of gravel. It was all hand dug. Over the years, I think maybe 20 years ago, a pond liner, for lack of a better term, was installed around the perimeter of the building. And there's no drainage system. The waterproofing is limited to a liner that runs around the perimeter of the building. We are reasonably comfortable and haven't made a foundation waterproofing part of this scope on account that we're capturing all of the roof drainage, and we'll capture it via gutters and downspouts, and we're going to pipe it underground to a storage basin, a basin that the water can soak into the ground. We'll filter it, and it'll go through a little filter chamber, and then it'll dissipate into the ground.
Why were there only trusses on this side, not on the west side?
There are. My point being that there's buttresses on both the east and west side, and their design, their alignment, their dimensioning relates exactly to the center of the trusses above. They stack on top of them.
Great.
I'd love to show you guys the sanctuary. And we can go back out this way and go up the stairs to the back entrance, up the metal stairs.
Does that the rubber, whatever you call it,
The pond liner or
Pond
whatever.
liner. That works better than French drains?
No. Ideally,
Or-
it should have maybe an asphaltic, a hot applied kind of waterproofing, and a cross section of gravel and a French drain that would take it to a dry well or something. But we don't have any way to get away from the building. Specifically, we're mitigating all of the water that falls from the roof.
Right.
Okay? We're going to pipe it away. but I don't have the ability to take anything away at this level, at that level 6 feet down, in terms of any other infrastructure.
Okay.
So we believe that it's reasonably responsible, and then that's been substantiated by, you know, everyone's paying attention. Fake beam material. There's nothing structural to it. It's all it's all 1 inch, 3/4, 1 inch thick material, and above it are the actual trusses. The bottom of the truss is extended by design down into the ceiling a little bit. So this is the decorative woodwork just to conceal them. So behind them are the original trusses, and standing where I am, you can see that their path follows down on top of the buttresses. So outboard of them, we installed the new trusses. And to start the process, we had to prepare. And next to Steve is Pat Burrill, and he's our job site supervisor, and he's responsible for all the day-to-day activity. So Pat and his crew, all of us really, we all worked together, including the masons, but we had steel frames built, and we cut channels on the interior of these points, these concrete bearing points, these concrete slugs. So we channeled on both sides of them and put these steel frames in. Specifically, all of the roof weight bears right next to where we were working. And we had to create and consolidate a high-strength concrete slug that was capable of carrying all of the new weight of the truss right next to where all the weight is already sitting. So to do that, we channeled using this really expensive saw, and we let in these giant 6-inch by 6-inch steel frames and tensioned them to hold the steel, and then worked inside of the steel frame to hand dismantle all the different pieces of stone. And then we cleaned it. These pieces of concrete, they're 18 inches wide, let's say they're 24 or 30 inches tall, and they extend 12 inches back. So I described the section, the cross section of the wall, as 3 sections of 6-inch. So we went 2 sections back in general. So we were able to maintain the original exterior facade. We went 2 sections in. And once we had created this space, we built templates that held anchor bolts and hung the anchor bolts in. And we mixed 5,000, 6,000 PSI grout and poured it all in place. But meanwhile, to elevate everything, because each truss leg for the new trusses is a different length, so everything extends a little bit differently. So using lasers and full survey equipment, we established the distance down to the 1/16 of an inch in distance and in elevation as well. And that allowed us to fly the trusses in. So the trusses were built in basalt. We had Myers Steel build them for us. And we, over several years, and let me step back to say that 3.5 years ago we started working here. One of the parishioners, Fonda Patterson, contacted me after I had finished the Episcopal Church. And we started talking about this, and I hired an engineer, and the engineer did a study of the existing structure and called me and said, we're closing the building down. He had ran an analysis of all the different structural components and was concerned that we could not go through a winter. So we closed the building down. And in a couple of months thereafter, we designed and installed collar ties around each of the trusses, and we installed rods. And in between plates on rods that worked in opposition, we installed these red dial-up style jacks. And we put 9,000 pounds of pressure on one and 9,500 pounds of pressure on the other. Our engineer had calculated how much resistance we needed on the legs of these trusses. You see how high the ceiling is? So the truss is above with these long legs that extend down, and I'm speaking of the original truss. And so these legs were in this bending motion as they were overextended. So we put collar ties around them and pulled them together so that they were locked into place. And so this has been our temporary repair all the way up until last week when the boys removed them. So we put 10,000 pounds of pressure pulling them in, and we would put 3,000 or 4,000 pounds, and the building would go, and you could hear it, and it was physically, you could almost see it physically move. The building would groan. So we'd bring it up to say 4,000, and we come back 2 days later and we put 2 more thousand PSI on it. And so we did this over a week and a half until we had reached this design criteria that had been spelled out in terms of the calculations by the engineer. And so we just recently removed those. So that had been the stopgap for the last few years. The new design, the permanent design, was steel trusses that would sit outboard, and these are the trusses that you see. They were built in 3 sections in general. So we have an 18-foot section, an 18-foot section that were pre-assembled. And those were what you guys may have seen in the newspaper, or if you were here when we were flying them. We installed the 2 in from, we installed each of them through openings in the side of the roof. And then we landed them and temporarily held them up using outriggers supported by the old trusses. Additionally, we found that we could use threaded rod, and we could manipulate them and fine-tune them using some threaded rod. That was the only way to hold them up. And then we hand-built these little sections in between. So we had been very, careful about all of the prep work. And in about 6.5, 7 hours, we had both trusses in and bolted together on crane day. I mean, everyone was running. I don't think anybody really had lunch. But we had expected it would take a day, 2 days, 2.5 days. And in 6 hours, everything bolted together. It went really quite well. So the trusses weigh 12,000 pounds apiece. In addition to that 25,000 pounds, we have another 25,000 pounds of steel in the attic supporting all of the hips and valleys, and everything rests and bears on these steel trusses. And we've additionally, all the weight that was still on the new trusses has been pushed all the weight that was on the original trusses has now been blocked and pushed onto to these new trusses. And so right now, this week, Pat had the last weld done. All of the steel is in place, all the framing is complete in the attic, and we're to a point where the engineer will evaluate and review everything, make sure that everything is managed, and now we get to start to put a roof on. We've been, the sequence to put all the steel in, we had to put all the steel in first, get all the steel in place, and then we would start tearing the roof off. We couldn't tear the roof off first and waterproof it with any confidence. So now that we got all the steel in, we've been working diligently to tear off all of the old shingles, the old flashings, get it down to the original planking material that was installed, and we put new plywood on it, and then we put this ice and water shield, and we just finished the last side yesterday. So we really have gotten to a turning point in the last 2 weeks, which feels great. We've been very concerned about exposing ourselves to the organ, exposing weather to the organ. The organ is very valuable. Behind this section of pipes, there's I think 700 or 800 smaller pipes between wooden wind pipes and metal pipes behind it. And so we have all that protected in plastic as well.
So this building's not going to collapse. It's secure now.
The building's secure. I mentioned to you, this phase of work is in short to stabilize the shell of the building. Both all of the masonry from water infiltration to reinforce the roof and waterproof the whole structure. And additionally, stabilize the structural the problems in the roof. So with that having been done, that's only a portion of our work. We still have the balconies are closed. People can't spend any time on the balconies. We have additional structural issues that haven't been addressed. And then at some point in time, we need to address lighting, electrical, heating, cooling, so on, fire sprinklers. So those are the next phases. Anybody have any questions?
Who made the organ?
I'm sorry?
Who manufactured the organ?
I don't know. I know that it's very valuable. There's been conversation of its replacement value is short of $1 million. I don't know. It's not original to the building.
It is rumored that it is one of the most valuable organs on the western slope. Isn't that right, Betty? Yeah. And the sound is very incredible. So it's really sought after by the Aspen Music Festival. They, some of their musicians love playing it.
The acoustics in this room are discussed as being ideal.
Well, the architect who did this was actually also a singer, and he really worked at making this acoustically superior. Alan Fletcher, CEO of the Aspen Music Festival, says that the acoustics in this particular, in the sanctuary, is some of the best small venue acoustics on the western slope. He said it's quite good, and they do their young artists recitals here because of that, because the acoustics is so superior. So that's just an unusual fact in a church.
I hope that
building.
we're communicating the value of the building, specifically in terms of a community resource and just an architectural piece that's original from 1890 and hasn't been disturbed along the way. Is anyone interested in seeing the attic?
Is there any chance the acoustics would be affected by the renovation?
I wouldn't suspect so. The only modification to the interior will be these 2 1/4-inch rods that punctuate the ceiling. And so we are going to re-drywall these holes that we've had to build to get everything in, and then try to patch the ceilings together.
Will you leave the tie rods exposed?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Let them be what they are. So, all right. I'm happy to take anyone who wants to go up into the attic space.
Go ahead and work up.
Okay. Robert, are you scared of my
No. Need help you? So this is all new steel.
All of this is new steel.
Is there any steel in the original building?
Yes. These rods right here.
Right there.
The weight on the old trusses. So you'll see blocks on them right there, Howie, where we're picking up the top chord of the old truss. All right. So the rods, and at each corner, the roof makes a hip at each corner, and at each hip, there being 4 of them, we have significant pieces of tube steel that project out horizontally. Then they intersect the bottom side of the original hip, and then the tube steel runs down and sits on top of the masonry, and is bolted to the masonry.
The attic was pretty dry. It was extremely dry.
It was scary to weld in here.
So there wasn't any rot.
What's that?
There wasn't any
No,
rot.
no. When we first started, there were bats flying around and living in here, and this whole place was full of bat guano and just general feces, and it was ugly. And we cleaned all of the old insulation out. So part of the reason for all of this is that the building has always historically suffered from ice damming, and all the valleys would ice up at the eaves, and water would back up behind it, and that would pour into the building. Particularly over here on this northwest side, there's always staining that just always happens in the winter months. So the reason being is that there's never been any insulation up here. So when the heat gets turned on, it just comes right through the ceiling and it melts everything up here. So what we've done is now we can go ahead and we can insulate the floor that we're standing on. So we're going to have insulation right where we're standing. Specifically, we're going to be an R49 here. And so the roof up here is going to try to be the same temperature as the outside. So that now we're not going to constantly melt the snow. The water isn't going to run down to do the eave because of the interior, and we're also going to save money in terms of our heating bills.
And the reason the insulation is paid for by CORE, the Community Office of Resource Efficiency, through a grant that was written. So that is paid for and taken care of by CORE, which is really great.
Yeah, that's the left. That's the top side of the plaster.
Was there asbestos here? Is this insulation?
No, we're pre-asbestos here. I had it tested before we started. It was one of the requirements for the building permit. No asbestos was found. So part of our preliminary stabilization was all this upper framing. So we did a lot of this upper framing several years ago. And then all the steel and all this lower framing we did here recently. In general terms, every rafter has been re-supported. So as you look around, there's companion rafters on almost every single rafter so it's been re-supported. My point being is we've essentially built a roof inside of a roof and installed all of the support for it underneath the roof at the same time, which is why it took longer than one would, than normally in terms of not having a roof. Made it much more challenging and exciting.
It's kind of amazing. The old wood looks in great shape.
This is the original truss right here.
You'd think there'd be deterioration after all these years, but there
No.
isn't.
It's all in great shape.
When you tighten the building up,
Yes.
so you were putting the pressure in to
Pulling it in.
pull it in and restabilize the shelf. How much did the walls move, the ceiling? You mentioned the sounds. Did you laser measure it to get any kind of sense of distance?
We pulled the legs in,
Yeah.
a net like an inch and a half. We slid the base of the trusses in, and so we saw that bit of movement
Wow. On each side.
on each side, where they had extended off from where they were originally designed to plane into.
Yeah.
So these beams were put in 3 years ago?
Yeah, this stuff was put in 3 years ago. This and some of the framing that holds the upper section. All the discoloration on some of the upper rafters, that's all from animal. That's all from stats.
How about the beds?
What about?
Didn't you have to relocate them?
No, we started banging around. They all relocated themselves.
Oh, they did. Okay.
There was a movement to relocate the bats, but they did it on their own.
Oh, they figured out.
Yeah,
a
they
way.
figured it out.
And that cable right there, does that lift the
This is
central chandelier?
It does, and that's original hardware from 1890. There's a wrench, a small spud wrench that was hand built that turns a little that is accepted by on a little spindle over on the other side, and you can wheel it up and down. The pipes over here are for the organ, and so the bellows for the organ are in a mechanical room, and that runs through the back of the organ chamber and comes up and it crosses this room and drops back down, and there's a small organ cabinet in the back of the sanctuary up high in the balcony. And that pipe is what drives those pipes. So in general terms, all of this is complete and inspected by the engineer, and this is what we've put together and is capable of carrying the roof. So this part of the building is done. Next, we're going to move on to putting the roof, gutters, downspouts, some civil infrastructure, painting, and that's the next effort, the next phase of what we'll work towards.
Very exciting.
Steve, what is the wood that they use for both the trusses and planking for the...
We think it's just fir.
Fir?
I think it's Doug fir, yeah.
Okay. So that would have come from around here.
And if you look at these, if you look at these trusses, here's the bottom cord. So this is the top. This is the back of the ceiling right here, where you see the mud coming through the lath. And this is the bottom cord of the truss that projects down below the line of the ceiling, the plane of the ceiling, and hence this is what those the box beams, the beam, the woodwork conceals the bottom chords of these trusses. So this steel here is original to the building in terms of this was installed and holds the truss in tension.
So those are connected to the faux beams that
No,
east and west.
This steel?
Or, well,
No.
it's enclosed by the faux
Correct.
beams, faux wood.
Yep. So very little steel used on the building, just for bolts holding the top plate in, and some bolting in the trusses.
So this is off topic, but to do the rock on the outside, they probably used a system of pulleys.
Mm-hmm. What do you call a pole? A gin pole? A gin pole? A gin pole?
Yeah. Well,
So they would have a long piece of a pole that would extend out,
Oh.
and it would be supported here
Oh,
maybe,
sorry.
and there would be a pulley on the end of it.
Mhm.
It would make a small, crude little crane,
Yeah.
and they would wheel things
Oh,
up.
that
So
way.
that's how they would do it.
Because there's no way they could carry it.
I'm sure they would put counterbalances
Yeah.
and do things like this to get some of the larger stones. And so to get some of the stones are 400 or 500 pounds on these capstones. It would take 6, 7 guys, 4 or 5 guys to move them around.
Fascinating.
We know because we have to do it.
Good point.
Because Steve has to do it. So
It's amazing that block up there hasn't cracked. Or is that a new block? So underneath the nut that's on the top up there.
all the lighter wood is new.
Okay.
If it's a darker tone and it's old.
Because they had to crank that nut around it originally, didn't
That nut right there.
Yeah.
That nut. All the shiny nuts are all new.
they? No, I meant the black nut right there.
Yes.
Attached to that cable.
That's what's holding this truss, and it
Yeah.
holds it in tension. Mm-hmm.
Fabulous, Steve. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. It's a great project. It's fun to share.
Well, that's it for our hard hat tour of the historic Aspen Community Church renovation taking place here in Aspen, Colorado in August 2013. It's been a great tour and we've learned a lot. The community church is not only a church of many faiths, but it houses many programs, lectures, and community events and performances. And so it's a wonderful community center for all of us here in the Roaring Fork Valley. Thank you all for coming, and we appreciate the community's support, and we hope to see you